together some survey work on drivers and inhibitors and what people are expecting in cloud technologies in general. So we're going to share some of that research, brand fresh, spanking hot new off the shelves, and then we're going to react to it on stage here. So why don't Michael, why don't you kick it off and explain the concepts, and then we'll do introductions, and I'll drive some of the survey results.
So in my day job, I'm a VC, and as you probably well know, VCs have got a reputation for adding zero value. So as I actually entered the VC world about 20 years ago, the first thing I did was organize a CIO panel to try to figure out whether we could invest in what wasn't really called software as a service, but it was the beginning of it. And I was just shocked to hear that CIOs just didn't see that this was going to be a phenomenon that they would actually take advantage of. And they thought it was for SMBs and be non-mission critical, etc. So we kicked off what's now become known as the Future Cloud Computing Survey 3 years ago. And we did it for a view that we thought that the industry would benefit from seeing a vendor-neutral perspective on what's possible in the cloud. And so I'm happy to say that the results today are collaborated on with 57 collaborators. So this genuinely is vendor-neutral. It's actually the broadest survey in the industry. Everybody from Amazon and Microsoft to some of the smaller players like, for example, Membrane, or in the most recent round, Eucalyptus. So delighted to do this, and we believe that this partnership is best served by working with GigaOM, so we have some independent analysis. So David, I'll leave it to you to kick it off from there.
All right, so what we've got on the, what we did is we collaborate on designing the survey and ask some questions of different audiences. So the Northbridge survey is kind of representative of slightly ahead of the curve users and vendors who are probably a little bit ahead of the curve as well. And then GigaOM Research surveys a panel of about 300 mainstream IT buyers. So what I'm going to show you for the next few minutes, and we're going to comment on, is the results of the comparable results. So you look at the GigaOM results, and you'll see what the mainstream is doing now, and then we'll look at the Northbridge results, and you'll understand what might be the next step, and then we'll talk about what the future looks like. So right now, the mainstream buyers in blue and Northbridge response panel base in gray, what you see is that just about everybody is adopting cloud technology somewhere across their industry. Software as a service obviously is the widest spread, and in fact some of that's probably sneaking in without IT buyers being aware of it with a lot of the side door entries. But what we take away from this one is that the hint of it, the growth was mostly in infrastructure as a service last year, and there's hints that platform as a service is what people are looking towards for the next 5 years or so. So we'll be watching that closely. The other thing that we found out from a basic adoption perspective already is that clearly the movement is towards hybrid cloud. So the leading edge buyers, but also even the trailing edge buyers, when you ask them what they're going to be buying in the next couple of years or so, the movement is towards this mixed environment. And that clearly, it sort of establishes a trend, but it's also clearly setting the stage for some potential drivers and inhibitors, or there's some good stuff and some bad stuff. So what the buyers, the mainstream buyers are saying is the primary reason that they're adopting cloud computing is for cost. But the more sophisticated adopters do still recognize that cost or early entry, low barrier of entry cost is a good thing. But they're starting to think about things like scalability and agility. And that makes me want to ask Gaurav what he thinks, how do you react to that? Tell us a little bit where you are, who you are in
I'm Gaurav, Dhillon, founder and CEO of a company called SnapLogic. We're the elastic integration company. If you want to know more about that, we're doing a session at 1:05 p.m. today, so that's all I'll say now. Okay, we've been doing integration for a while. We have lots of people using the next generation product that we have now at SnapLogic. I'm a little surprised because, yes, the sort of agility is low on the scale. Maybe we're just talking to a lot more early adopters, right? When we talk to people, they're like, look, we know it's not going to be cheaper to use Salesforce as opposed to Siebel, but we can get a lot more stuff done in 100 days. Right? You don't need IT people to write reports. You don't need all that kind of stuff. So I'm surprised that agility is not teeter-totter with cost. Because I think there's a sort of false lure of cost. Now, maybe infrastructure as a service is driven by cost, but SaaS is about agility. Very, very clear to me.
But I think David said it very well, by the way, just to point that out. The gray bar there, it is more agility. So there's early stage visionary adopters that are exactly where you are, Gaurav.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Do we think that anything will emerge in the near future that might pull that away, be another driver that would show up next?
I think it depends on your sample size and the constituency, how much of IA is folks you're talking to versus SaaS versus PaaS. That might disrupt this result as well.
Certainly.
The SaaS guys are more focused less on cost, but more about the agility and the business value. If you introduce that as a question, you'll see that pop up.
So that's the way we should ask the question next year then, perhaps.
Well, so just to throw this in there so we can kind of give people who are in the audience, that this whole survey is like 90 slides long. We're covering 6 of them.
Right.
Just to give you a sense of this. But the exact thing that you suggested we did do this year, which is we split between, for example, buyers, so CIOs and vendors. And actually, they were amazingly in sync this year. Last year, we had a major rift, and there were certain things that people didn't agree on, like, for example, ROI and TCO. This year, they were very in sync, which is a good sign.
So the flip side of the coin, obviously, on drivers of cloud computing adoption would be the inhibitors. And we asked both of our survey bases to respond what was what was slowing down their adoption. And we gave them a good laundry list of things to look at. And so my takeaway from this slide is that perhaps surprisingly at this stage, security is still head and shoulders, especially with the mainstream buyers, security is still head and shoulders the primary kind of concern about adopting cloud technology in general. Because privacy is only half a step away from security as well, and that shows up pretty high as well. What we're seeing from the earlier adopters, the leading edge adopters, is things like reliability is starting to emerge as something of a concern. Compliance with regulatory conditions and issues, and both internal and external, and then lock-in and compatibility. I don't show compatibility on the slide, but compatibility was a similar score to lock-in. So I think a lot of companies are worried about getting stuck with a particular company. And I think that is kind of like a leading edge question, if anything, for
that's a buying side.
Dude, yeah. So, Dude, maybe you could talk a little bit about how SoftLayer is thinking about. I know you can't think about it too much yet, but how are you thinking about addressing the compatibility issues with, OpenStack and et cetera, that you're going through?
Yeah, well, we view all of those issues, all of these is very important. Compatibility is important, but the way we approach all of these problems is really by building a platform that can be leveraged in multiple scenarios. So our product offerings, both single-tenant, multi-tenant offerings, allow customers to sort of find the right level of security versus reliability versus agility that they need for the environment, the product that they're building, the application they're building.
What are the two suppliers on the panel seeing in terms of buyers choosing best-of-breed solutions versus turnkey one-stop shopping? Is there any patterns in there?
Absolutely best-of-breed. Absolutely best-of-breed. I mean, you're buying Salesforce, you're buying Workday, you're buying on the SaaS, they're best-of-breed. I wouldn't be qualified to answer the infrastructure. I think that's where more of the lock-in fears come in as well. So.
Well, I think this chart and the previous chart really show a lot about exactly what we see with our buyers. Initially, mainstream buyers do have security concerns, but as they get to know the platform, that's mostly an unknown. That's a fear of the unknown more than it is a fear based in the realities of what the cloud really brings to them. And as they get past that, they become sort of the leading edge buyer. They become a sophisticated buyer, I think you called it. Issues of reliability, agility, those are the things that really begin to drive them to one platform or another. So the buying patterns change as their experience level changes.
I'm going to show you a bit about complexity in a second too, but I do think the compatibility and lock-in thing is probably on
big issue.
Someone's on minds. So, but what kind of opportunities does that actually present for technology suppliers, or is this a big? I don't know what I'm asking here, but can you buy a solution to that problem?
Well, again, I can only speak from the survey, but you ask a very relevant question. So there's a specific slide where the customers identified 4 things that they thought were extremely important for the vendors to address. And I'll simplify the whole thing by simply saying that it came down to lock-in, because they wanted interoperability, and control, which was a separate point, because that's really visibility and manageability that they were going after. And then they really wanted the ability to understand how ROI was being derived. So they needed better evidence of what the TCO was. And that was a business case challenge. And it turns out that's sort of a dual-sided thing.
Right.
So when we got into the discussions, I know you've identified this in your reports, Kash, people think about things differently. It's not just about the SLA, it's about actually how does this turn out in your business service. And so you have to actually integrate the cloud into the business service and measure an end-to-end TCO. And we're not doing a great job of that either as an industry or as customers. But if you can do those three things, then these inhibitors, although they're still going to be there, getting away from security, etc., will be, I think, an easy part to address.
And there are technologies from public companies like VMware that's got a product called hybrid cloud that will allow you to run your stuff in your private data center as flexibly as you can on Amazon or Rackspace or SoftLayer.
So then we asked the adopters of these technologies what they thought, how that was affecting their own internal IT manageability. And it's pretty strongly an indicator, even with the earliest or the leading edge or sophisticated adopters, that it's adding, cloud computing is adding complexity to their operations. There is a little bit of polarization, so it sounds like there's a few people, or more than a few people, a good double handful. Now, a lot of a significant sector of the adopters are actually thinking that they are finding some really positive, removing complexity from their issues, but it's still a big issue. It's still a big problem. And then I think what that leads to is we ask a question about what do you expect in terms of TCO and spending, and are you spending more to manage that complexity, for instance? And the consensus, as you can see from the slide, there's not a tremendous amount of consensus that a good quarter of the population, both types of adopters, were spending more. A small portion. In fact, I want to say actually the indication is it's not going to be less spending. So that cost thing right up front is probably going to go away with the infrastructure stuff going forward. However, willing to put up the money and then achieve either a better total cost of ownership or similar cost of ownership, but other benefits like agility, I think is interesting. And what this made me think was that if this complexity is going on, and if these companies are expecting, or sort of have expectations of better cost of ownership, where does that come from? Where do we see that emerge?
I think what we see a lot is that a lot of the applications that are going to the cloud and really using it in that sophisticated way, more than just instead of a data center, but rather using the cloud for the breadth, the global distribution, that sort of thing, is that they're profit centers. And so a profit application, which is where agility really comes in, you can take a lot more risk up front because it's a small cost to take the risk, but when it succeeds, the cost increases, right? The spending increases. And so the way we see it, the way our customers talk to us, is that that's the pattern that's really behind this, as compared to an enterprise application, which is fairly well boxed in, fairly well defined cost up front. There's a scale to the
This is a good point.
Yeah,
This is a very good point.
This is really a good point because it's changing the behavior of the buyer. Right? I mean, they can try something and then they can scale it when it works, as opposed to having to say, well, you know what, we're just going to go buy this house. They can rent it, try buy it, and they can scale it up or down. We have a lot of people in retail who went to the cloud precisely because they wanted to have more capacity around in the holidays. Right? Because otherwise you have to go lock down a bunch of hardware for your burst capacity. So you can do better capacity planning at all kinds of custom-built websites and other kinds of things with that. So I would agree. I would totally agree with that.
And it's also dependent whether you talk about SaaS or IaaS. What we found is when you look at outsourced infrastructure as a service, cost is a huge driver. Lower cost is a huge driver. If you look at companies like Amazon Web Services or SoftLayer or Rackspace, the amount of revenues they generate, you can easily expand them by 5 to 10x to see how much traditional IT they're displacing. So I think cost is a big element. I think some of the folks that are talking about increased spending because they probably are shifting more percentage of their workloads, that means higher spending. But on a per workload basis, I'd be surprised if it's higher cost. It's probably vastly lower cost.
So if there's some conservative CIOs in the audience or IT decision makers, perhaps this is a way to get back at the table, right? If you're not just a service provider, but you can use these new technologies to prove revenue generation, prove new revenue streams for your company, and you can go back to being the hero rather than just the poor cost-cutting guy. What does this imply for systems integration and the services that the companies offer? Is this an opportunity to address some of these things, or prove it, or give help? And then as that rolls out, do software companies then have to build up their consulting organization?
That's actually a great question. I didn't realize that we'd get into the systems integration thing, but there's a piece it reminds me of in the survey, which is, it relates to this too, is as you talked about it, we're talking about two different things when we talk about infrastructure and software as a service. So software as a service benefits people see, number one is continuous innovation. So this whole challenge of rolling out applications in the past and adopting them, was so painful. Now it's continuous. One of my public companies, Demandware, I would say that, in the e-commerce world, the whole challenge is Amazon adds a new feature. It used to be a year before ADG could add it. We add it in a week, and it's out and nobody even thinks about it. That's a huge deal. Now, what that means, to come back to your question about systems integrators, is that they themselves can pass on the benefits of business process as a service almost continuously too. Now, you need people like SnapLogic doing what they do at the back end. It's easy to sort of gloss over that. And there's real complexity still to overcome in that. But in the end, I think the systems integrators figure out how to get the best of both worlds, and they do the business process integration. They use continuous innovation on software as a service. Both parties are going to win, both the vendors and the customers.
I chime in and say, look, it's changing. Like the service integration business and the integration business are both changing. the sort of 9x consulting multiplier SAP purchase is so last century. You're not going to see that anymore, right? You're going to see rapid deployment, continuous innovation. But there are services companies that are building good-sized practices on IaaS and platform and SaaS. And I think from our vantage point, being able to sort of give them those option value, almost think of it as a trading system, where you have the option value to adopt continuous innovation A or B by using either something we build, SnapLogic, or our competitors, or hand code, or whatever. But that is the right way to go because of the change that you're going to have.
Yeah.
The stuff on-premise is going to be static for the large business. The new stuff is going through such a flux that frankly, I'm not sure any one of those companies know what's going to happen in 5 years.
Okay, Kash, you